Hi there, I hope you're doing great and are enthusiastic to keep improving your chess skills. Before we start with the current lesson, let's recollect quickly what we have discussed so far. So, when you're playing middle game, the first thing you need to remember is the question, what can I attack in opponent's territory? You need to go forward into opponent's half of the board and attack something there. More specifically, you need to attack his king or his pawns. In either case, you need to move your pieces in center forward direction. These are the main strategies, main guidelines that will work in any middle game position. Following these guidelines, you can play really well and crush even very experienced opponents. Now we will deepen your knowledge and we'll see how these general strategies work in typical middle game positions. And this way, your task will be super easy because you will not only know in general what you need to do, but you will also know very specific ideas and patterns that you can apply in the most common middle game situations. In the current lesson, we'll talk about double pawns. Double pawns can appear in a huge variety of different openings. For example, in the Nimzo defense, which is one of the most popular opening lines. Here, at some point, black may take white's knight on c3. For instance, white may force it right now with play on a3, and then after this exchange, we will have these double pawns on the c-file. Another opening is a Caro-Kann defense. After these following moves, here the main move for black is bishop to f5, but there is another variation with knight to f6, and then after an exchange, black will take with one of the pawns, and in any case we will have the position with those double pawns on the f-file. In fact, of course, there are many different openings which can generate the positions with double pawns. Good thing for you is that the plans in all of those positions will be approximately the same. Now we'll learn those plans and you will know how to deal with any of such sort of positions. This is not a real game, of course, it's just a training position. I removed most of the pieces from the board simply so that nothing deflects you and we can focus on the double pawns and understand the main ideas and plans in positions with and against double pawns. In the original situation, as you're certainly aware, the pawns are standing in line and then they're drawn, and normally this is a great situation for black. Pawns get doubled after an exchange. For example, if we add two minor pieces and white captures black's knight, black recaptures with a pawn, and now we see those double pawns on the f-file. So that's how the double pawns appear. Now let's talk about this position. So what happened and what changed in the plans of both sides? Well, the first thing is that now black has those weak pawns. And in fact, all of them are now weak. White can attack these pawns and capture them easily. Let's come back to the original pawn formation and just compare it with what we can see right now on the board. If we imagine that there is a normal pawn structure and white tries to attack one of these pawns, for example by playing rook g1, hitting the g7 pawn, then it's just enough for black to advance this pawn forward, and now the pawn is very well protected by the two other pawns, and so black has nothing to worry about. Instead, if white tries to attack any other pawn, again black can very easily advance it and keep it protected. Therefore, you can see that with a normal standard pawn structure, the pawns can protect each other really well. This does not happen when pawns are doubled. In the situation like that, it's enough for white to attack any of the black pawns and white will be able to capture it easily. That's happening in real games very often. But this is the main drawback of positions with double pawns, they are weak. In addition to that, there is another disadvantage when your pawns are doubled. once again, let's come back to the position with the standard pawn structure, when pawns are standing in line. There is white's bishop standing here in the center, and imagine white wants to go forward to opponent's side of the board and do something. First of all, you can see that the most forward move there on the king side is impossible, because this square is protected by the pawn. If white tries to go forward to g5, then black can easily kick off this bishop by advancing one of his pawns, like playing h6, and the white's bishop will have to retreat. Now let's compare it with the situation with double pawns. If you take a look at this position, you can see that there are a couple of the weak squares around those pawns that white can easily occupy with his pieces. If white places his pieces on f5, h5 or h6 squares, there will be no way for black to get rid of white's pieces. To conclude, double pawns create weak pawns and weak squares around them. Now, what is the plan if you're playing against double pawns? First of all, let's recollect the general middle game strategies. We know that in the middle game you need to go forward into opponent's half of the board. With double pawns, you have weak squares around them, which you can very easily exploit to invade and occupy with your pieces. So by this you achieve your target of going forward into opponent's half of the board. Secondly, in the middle game you need to either attack opponent's king or pawns. With the double pawns, you have some easy targets for your attack, those weak pawns. So that's the active plan. If you're playing against double pawns in the middle game, you need to attack those weak pawns and occupy the weak squares around them. Now let's see how those general patterns work in a practical game. This is a game between Magnus Carlsen playing white and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave playing black. Here black found an interesting tactical trick. He played knight takes d5. Perhaps he thought that white overlooked this double attack. Now if white captures the knight, black takes back the bishop on g5, gaining an extra pawn during these tactical complications. However, instead of taking the knight on d5 directly, white found a powerful intermediate move, which was probably overlooked or at least underestimated by black. Instead of taking the knight directly, white first played bishop h6. So white wants that black take this bishop with his pawn, which will damage his pawn structure a lot. And black really has to do that, because otherwise white will start collecting those pawns on the king side. Therefore black took the bishop. Now before taking black's d5 knight, white made another intermediate move, queen g4 check, attacking black's king, and then white finally took that knight. So now we see the more static position. The complications ended. Although black won a pawn, he damaged his pawn structure a lot, and now we see those double pawns and also the weak pawn on f7. What would be the white's plan here? What do you think? Well, we already know that. You need to attack those weak pawns and also use the weak squares around those weak pawns to advance your pieces forward to the opponent's half of the board. So by now white already has the excellently placed knight on f5. In addition to that, he also has the square h5 and eventually maybe even f6, although currently it's protected. So white may use those pieces and try to place his pieces there, which will of course put very serious pressure onto black's position. So this is white's plan in general, and now let's see how that happened in the actual game. Black played king h8 to remove his king from the opposition of white's queen. White played h4 just to kick off the bishop. Now after bishop h6, already white could win that pawn on h6 by simply capturing it. White didn't play that move. Maybe just he was afraid that after knight h6 black may play knight d3 with a double attack of white's rook and the b2 pawn. Oh, anyway, instead of taking the pawn immediately, he played knight c to e3, which is also a good idea because black's pawns are weak and most likely white will be able to capture them at any point. Black played bishop c8, put in the pin, white's knight, so white removed the queen from that pin. Black played bishop g7, trying to protect his weak pawn. Now white found another way to bring his piece into the weak square of black, into the square h5. Can you see this move? Well, obviously white can advance his queen there, but the queen is already active, it's already doing some good job, and white found a way to transfer the piece, which currently is not very much active, to that square h5. So white decided to bring his bishop there. He played bishop h3, and then through g4 the bishop came to h5, strengthening the white's pressure and taking aim at another weak pawn of black, at that pawn on f7. Now you see that white took advantage of the black's weaknesses to focus and bring all of his major pieces to the king side. On the next move, the white can also bring another knight to g4, and the concentration of white's pieces on the king side will be overwhelming. Black decided to exchange one of those pieces. After the exchange, black tried to seek for some counterplay. He played c6, but it didn't help him very much. At this position, white found another maneuver to keep attacking black's weak pawns. He found a way to attack once again that weak pawn on f7. Can you find the maneuver? How can white reposition one of his pieces to strengthen the attack of that pawn? White repositioned his queen from queen d1 and then putting it to d5, where it hits many of the black's weaknesses, and in particular that pawn on f7. And in fact, right now, black position crumbles. He cannot protect all of his weaknesses because white also attacks that rook on c6 at the same time. If black tries to retreat on c7 to protect both the rook and the pawn, then another pawn will fall, and just many of the black's pawns drop off. White will now start collecting all of them, and black's position just falls apart. As you can see in this game, white very clearly realized the main plan of playing against double pawns. He occupied weak squares around those double pawns, and he attacked weak pawns. At the end, he simply captured those weak pawns and gained decisive material advantage. Let's have a look at a slightly different situation, which is also very typical. In this position, white also has the double pawns. This time they are on the f-file. However, in contrast to the previous example, here white also has a pawn on the adjoining line, this pawn on e3, which is making a great job in protecting and covering those weaknesses. Thanks to this pawn on e3, the f4 pawn is very well protected and cannot be attacked by black. And that's why, of course, if you have a position like that as white, this is really great for you. If you have your forward double pawn protected by the pawn from the adjoining line, this strengthens your position a lot. Nevertheless, the pawn on h3 remains to be weak and may be exploited by black at some point of the game. Of course, right now it's hard to imagine how black can attack that pawn, but this is a long-term weakness. White cannot get rid of it. So even after many moves in this game, somewhere in the middle game or in the end game, black may take advantage of that weak pawn and capture it finally. So the one problem of white in this position is the weak pawn on h3. Another problem is the weak square on h4. This is the square that black may occupy with his piece, and that's what he did with his next move. He played knight to f5, threatening to go knight h4. So white started to remove his pieces from this danger, like transfer the knight to h4, and this is already one good thing for him, is that he was able to brought the piece into white's half of the board and create some threats. Then game continued, both sides just started to develop his pieces. And here we face the situation where black needs to find the middle game plan. We know that when an opponent has double pawns, generally speaking, you need to attack those pawns and occupy weak squares around them. As for occupying weak squares, well, black already did so by putting his knight on h4. But how can black attack white's pawns? Well, that's quite a challenging task, once again, just because the white's pawns are very well protected currently, they are supporting each other and they are quite strong. Another problem of black is that there are no open lines that black can use to start attacking those pawns directly. And that's why he found a clever plan, which is a very typical plan for such positions. He decided to trade off the advanced double pawn, this pawn on f4. So let's see what happened. He played h6, aiming for playing g5 right now or after some preparation. And that actually happened after a few extra moves where black just prepared this advancement. He finally played g5. At first glance, it may seem counterintuitive, like black helps white to get rid of his double pawn. But let's see what happens after that. There are two great achievements for black that happened after this exchange. The first achievement is that black removed that f4 pawn which covered white's weaknesses. And now black can start attacking another pawn on f2. And the second great accomplishment for black is that now he has those open lines, which he can use to attack white's pawns with his pieces. The f6 queen is already doing a great job, putting pressure on that pawn on f2. In the future, black may also put his rook on the h-file, maybe even double rooks there, to pressure another white's weakness on the h3. So that's the second great thing that happened after this exchange. And again, white tried to get rid of one of his weaknesses by exchanging it. And then he traded off the queen for two rooks. But in this position, you see that the white's weaknesses are still there. Black cannot take the pawn right now, because then I'll reply with the rook to f1, taking back black's pawn on f7. However, instead, black simply played knight to f5, and then after rook e1, he played queen h4, attacking most of the white's weaknesses simultaneously, and white is defenseless because the rook is hanging, as well as both of his weak pawns. In the next few moves, black won both of those weak pawns, and he won the game soon after that. Let's come back to the most critical moment of the game. At this position where black prepared and played that critical advancement g5, which you need to remember. If you see that, there is a situation when opponent's doubled pawn is protected by the pawn from the adjoining line. That quite often creates a very solid position for your opponent where everything is protected and covered. And by trading off the advanced double pawn, you uncover opponent's weaknesses, and also you get new open lines for your pieces, which you can then use to attack opponent's weaknesses. We analyzed how to play against double pawns, but what if you have doubled pawns yourself? What are the positive sides of double pawns, and what should be your plan in such positions? The first positive side of having double pawns is that you have new open lines. For example, in a standard position, if we imagine that pawns are standing in line, it would be pretty difficult for black to activate his rook from the corner. Right now, however, thanks to the double pawns, black can play rook g8 and put the rook in a very active position on an open line easily. Also, I'll make any move for white, black has the extra diagonal for his bishop, which he didn't have before when there was his pawn on g7, and now he has that diagonal and he can develop his bishop to h6, also to an active square. So these are the first main advantages of black's position, is that he has new open lines and diagonals, thanks to his double pawns. And the second main advantage is that the double pawns may control some new important squares which they did not control earlier. For instance, right now the f6 pawn is controlling an important central square e5, which was not the case when this pawn was on g7. Black can take advantage of this extra control over the important central square and place his knight there using the support of his pawn, and by doing so he will improve his central position and can get some domination in the center. In this game between Anand and Aranyan, white played bishop e3, inducing black to double white pawns. This happened after this exchange. Now let's think why white decided to opt for the position like that where he has double pawns. The first factor is that there is that adjoining pawn on the d-file which supports the double pawn. And as we know, when you have a formation like that, these pawns are quite strong and pretty difficult to attack for black. So that's the first argument for these double pawns in this position. The second argument is that the white double pawns are standing in the center and they control many important squares in the center. They control pretty much all of the squares there. And that is something really great for white. Center is the most important part of the board. Therefore, if you can strengthen your control over central squares, this is always good for you. Double pawns can help you achieve this goal. That's why having double pawns in the center very often is a fine idea. Although having double pawns on a side very often is just bad, because they control the squares which doesn't have big importance anyway. Okay, let's go forward. Black played d6. Now it's time for white to compose his middle game plan. How do you think? What should be white's plan? You already know the general strategies for middle game. We already discussed typical patterns for such positions with double pawns. So you may want to pause the video for a minute and think about the white's plan. The first thing is that when you have double pawns, you have new open lines for your pieces. What is the new open line that white has thanks to his double pawn on e3? Well, that's the f-file, where he already has the rook, which can become very active in the future and can help white attack black's king. The second thing is that you need to use the good control that the double pawns provide you over the central squares, and you should try to move your pieces in those squares. In this case, white can take advantage of the squares d5 and f5 and move his pieces there, which will help him invade into black's camp, start going forward into opponent's half of the board. So that'll be the white's plan for the next couple of moves. That's why white played knight h4, which is a multi-purpose move. It prepares knight movement to f5 and at the same time it enables the f-file for the rook. Played bishop a6, and here white allowed black to trade off his bishop and double his pawns once again by simply playing bishop f5. Now after the exchange, you may wonder what's good about having this double pawn on c4. Well, the first thing is that black does not have any open lines against those double pawns. For instance, if you imagine that black does not have that e5 pawn, then black will easily target white's weaknesses and will try to attack them and capture them. But when the lines are closed, it is very difficult for opponent to attack your double pawns. So that's the first good thing for white. And the second good thing is that thanks to this double pawn on the c4, which he got after the exchange, he now has the new very good control over the central square d5, which he can certainly exploit in the future by placing his knight there. Now let's move on. Okay, h7 to protect black's kingside queen f3, increasing the pressure along the f-file, and black decided to make some maneuvers with the knight, but it failed due to knight takes h6. White is making a very good use of the f-file. Now in case black recaptures with the pawn, white will be able to capture the knight and therefore win the pawn. In the actual game, after knight takes h6, black recaptured with the king, but this exposes his king very much. White just starts the direct attack of that king, Rook f3, threatening rook g3, check. Trying to cover some squares, but then rook f5, attacking the knight, and then queen h4. And black is defenseless, white is simply going to play rook to g5, checkmate. And if black tries to cover that square somehow and move away the knight anywhere, then just queen h5, checkmate. Conclusion. When you play against double pawns, there are two main things you need to do. First thing, occupy weak squares around double pawns. This will help you invade into opponent's territory and start the attack later on. Second thing, attack his weak pawns. As we know, it's one of the main middle game ideas to attack opponent's pawns. When opponent has double pawns, you have the very clear target. If you play with double pawns, then you also have two major ideas. First thing, use new open lines to activate your pieces. Usually we're talking about rooks and sometimes about bishops. Second thing, make use of the squares controlled by your double pawns. Move your pieces there. This works especially great if you have double pawns in the center. Usually, in such a situation, it's quite fine for you, and if you can fix your piece on a square which is protected by one of your double pawns, this will help you fix your piece on a powerful square and have a long-term advantage. Congratulations, now you know all the typical patterns for positions with double pawns, which are very common situations in the middle games. In the practical part of the course, you'll be able to train these ideas and automate necessary skills. For now, just let me congratulate you by learning this new subject, and I look forward to talk to you in the next lessons.